is theism under further pressure now? I begin with a quote. Faith in science plays the role of the dominating religion of our time. This believing trust in science, which is taking over in our time much of the role played by religious faith in earlier ages, I shall call scientism in what follows, as the physician and philosopher Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker stated in his Gifford Lectures 1959 to 1960. Is thus, at least regarding societies in Western and Eastern Europe, scientism the successor of theism? Did the processes of modernization, including mechanical as well as technical progress, and the success of natural sciences lead to the secularization of society, that is, the loss of religion's significance in society, as the secularization thesis claims? Are we, after all, living in a disenchanted world, as Max Weber proposed? Whether or not this controversial secularization thesis is true regarding the explanation of why societies are becoming secular, at any rate, it seems that these societies are becoming secular. That is especially the case regarding the fact that belief that God exists is tending to diminish in our hemisphere. Particularly belief in God personally conceived is shrinking. And it is without doubt that besides a huge mechanical and technical progress, the natural sciences have been very successful in the sense of offering good explanations of sensually perceptible phenomena, thereby dispensing with the supernatural transcendent reality. What is more, as much as there is an ongoing debate about arguments for the existence of such a God in academia, at least, there are at least equally lively discussions about arguments against God's existence, such as the argument from evil and the hiddenness argument. In this context, two questions arise. First, are these arguments against the existence of God an offspring of this modern, more secular period? And second, are these arguments against the existence of God an even stronger objection to the truth of theism nowadays, or rather a higher threat to the reasonableness of theists who are still holding on to the truth of theism? The first is a historic question, the second a more philosophical one about the epistemic weight of the arguments for and against God's existence. In reply to the first question, it is obvious that the question needs to be denied, in relation at least to the argument from evil. It is well known that the Greek philosopher Epicure reportedly formulated this anti-theistic argument in the Hellenistic period, at least as mentioned in the writings of the patristic church Father Lactantius. As for the hiddenness argument, however, it is rather an offspring of modern period of time. I must affirm the question. In its detailed exposition discussed in contemporary analytic philosophy of religion, it only dates back to 1993, when the Canadian philosopher John Schellenberg published his book, Divine Hiddenness and Human Reason. This was actually his dissertation thesis, which he wrote under the supervision of Richard Swinburne in Oxford, and he made a book out of this thesis 2 or 3 years later. Schellenberg himself claims that the thoughts this argument entails are not entirely original, dating back to statements from the philosophers Ronald Hepburn, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Joseph Butler, yet the detailed argument itself he rightly claims to be his own. Hence, whereas the hiddenness argument may be said to be an offspring of modern time, the argument from evil is not. Regarding the second question, I think that the answer in relation to both arguments against God's existence is principally yes. Why and in which respect? The main reason is that the traditional arguments for the existence of God, which were presented as proofs for God's existence, that is, as sound deductive arguments, are commonly considered to be failed. Their inductive remake by Richard Swinburne, who claims that the cumulative case of these arguments forms an argument in which its true premises render the conclusion to be probably true, is impressive, but not widely accepted as sound inductive argument. Furthermore, as an empirical fact, the number of those believing that there is a God is shrinking. But if the existence of God is hardly taken to be certainly, or at least probably true, then it seems to be more than uncertain if there is a promising refutation of an argument against the existence of God. And if there is actually no promising refutation on offer, then the argument against the existence of God constitutes a rather severe objection to the truth of theism and a high threat to the alleged reasonableness of theists. In an atmosphere of general approval, however, on the contrary, in relation to the success of the arguments for the existence of God, that is, if God's existence is taken to be rather true, as in former days, it may, on the contrary, seem to be rather likely that an argument against God's existence can at least in principle be refuted, because it is considered to be rather true that God exists. So there must be something wrong with the argument. And even if there actually is no promising refutation of an argument against the existence of God on offer, then the latter anti-theistic argument still doesn't constitute such a severe objection to the truth of theism, or rather not such a high threat to the alleged reasonableness of theists. Yet in this paper I argue that at least the rather novel hiddenness argument is not really making things worse in the present times. Some will consider this good news, since, as I will suggest in this paper, there rather are promising refutations of this argument against God's existence. It might even be the case that reflection on the hiddenness argument's assumptions might help theism, at least as it is discussed in analytic philosophy of religion, to regain some depth and complexity. Regarding the other anti-theistic argument, however, the argument from evil, I claim that it remains a serious objection to the truth of theism and profoundly questions the reasonableness of theists, since, if I may say so, there are rather not any promising refutations of this argument on offer. More specifically, even though there are rather good defenses or theodicies regarding states of affairs involving moral evil, they are only able to solve the logical, but not the evidential version of the argument from evil. What is more, there is, as far as I can see, rather not a good defense of theodicy on offer regarding states of affairs involving natural evil. In what follows, I present the hiddenness argument by Schellenberg and argue why at least two premises, number 2 and 4, of it can be shown not to be necessarily true, thus concluding that at least this anti-theistic argument is unsound and puts no further pressure on theism. That is, this paper does not include meta-reflections on the nature of atheism, but presents one specific example of a recent criticizer of theism. What makes Schellenberg interesting, besides his sophisticated anti-theistic philosophizing, is that he is an atheist, and as an atheist he is not only a humanist, but also not pro-naturalistic or anti-religious, and yet religiously very curious about whether or not there is an ultimate transcendent reality devoid of any personal qualifications, like the ones that the God of theism probably exhibits. But this is just a side note. Okay. As the argument from evil, the hiddenness argument shares the same logical form in arguing with modus tollens that the existence of the God of theism, exhibiting certain attributes, would make it expectable that a certain state of affairs does not obtain in the actual world, but then states that the latter state of affairs does obtain, so that the conclusion is that this God does not exist. The divine attribute at the center of the hiddenness argument is perfect love, or rather omni-love, as Schellenberg puts it. The state of affairs which is not expected to obtain given the existence of a perfectly loving God consists in at least one finite person who does not believe that there is a God, even though she or he is not resisting personal relationship with God, or rather, in the wording of Schellenberg, he has some nice wording sometimes, the occurrence of non-resistant non-belief. So people who do not believe that there is a God are not resistant towards relationship with God. There wouldn't be one such person if a perfectly loving God exists. It's not to be expected. In what follows, I will introduce and discuss Schellenberg's hiddeness argument in a more fine-grained way. That is, I will firstly present the current form of the whole argument to you, and then, secondly, as an aside, explicate its premises one by one, by way of mainly challenging or giving some critical remarks on the soundness of these premises. Okay, the hiddeness argument by Schellenberg runs like this. First premise, necessarily, always necessarily, almost every premise is necessarily true from his viewpoint. If God exists, then God always perfectly loves all finite persons. Second, necessarily, if God always perfectly loves all finite persons, then God is always open to being in a personal relationship with any capable finite person. 3. Necessarily, if God exists, then God is always open to being in a personal relationship with any capable finite person. Next premise, 4. Necessarily, if God is always open to being in a personal relationship with any capable finite person, then it is not the case that any capable finite person non-resistantly lacks belief that God exists. Then, conclusion, necessarily, if God exists, then it is not the case that any capable finite person non-resistantly lacks belief that God exists. And then comes 6. There is at least one capable finite person, such that this capable finite person non-resistantly lacks belief that God exists. Conclusion, God does not exist. Okay, you've been very brave, and I'll go through the premises one by one. Of the argument's 4 premises as stated above, Schellenberg claims only one of these premises not to be necessarily true, yet true of course, namely premise 6. This premise makes an empirical claim about a state of affairs which obtains in the actual world involving the occurrence of non-resistant non-belief mentioned before. I agree that this premise is true in general as well as more specifically regarding 4 types of such non-believers proposed by Schellenberg. So he distinguishes between so-called former believers, lifelong seekers, converts to non-theistic religion, and isolated non-theists. I say shortly something about these types of non-belief. Former believers, it's quite clear, are those who once believed that God exists, but who then lost this belief and are trying to regain it. Lifelong seekers never believe that there is a God, but are trying to gain belief that God exists, be it consciously or unconsciously seeking. Converts to non-theistic religions once believed that God exists, but lost it along the way of inquiry, for example, into philosophical or religious matters, and now believe that a divine, transcendent, non-theistic reality exists. And isolated non-theists also lack belief that God exists because they were never able, epistemically speaking, to form the belief that there is a God due to their never being introduced to the concept of God as conceived by theism. For example, including those human beings living before the genesis of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, respectively. Their non-belief is defined as the lack of belief that God exists. More precisely, their non-belief, according to Schellenberg, may take the form either of skepticism or outright disbelief. A skeptic is lacking belief that God exists, but also lacking belief that God does not exist. A disbeliever, on the other hand, is lacking belief that God exists, but believes that God does not exist. Non-resistant non-belief consists of any such non-belief, Schellenberg doesn't say it's only one of these forms, skeptic or disbeliever, which generally involves a lack of belief that God exists, and the qualifier non-resistant non-belief involves a lack of resistance mentioned above, as a lack of resistance toward relationship with God. What is this resistance look like from Schellenberg's point of view? He describes it as a form of emotional or behavioral opposition towards God, and also as a kind of self-deception. As I see it on Schellenberg's account, that kind of resistance involves a conscious or unconscious desire not to personally relate to God, and actions or omissions supporting this conscious or unconscious desire not to personally relate to God. So in other words, lack of resistance, non-resistance, includes a lack of a desire not to personally relate to God, and a lack of any actions or omissions which support this lacking desire not to personally relate to God. However, these terms are not clarified further on, unfortunately, and remain somehow underdetermined in Schellenberg's work. Given the importance in his reasoning, this may seem surprising, especially because the topic of implicit and explicit biases is widely discussed, and because every theist reading the term resistant might think of the category of sin, which may be interesting to see how it relates to or is delineated from resistance. Yet for the moment, given this very rough definition of resistance, I grant Schellenberg that it refers to a state of affairs obtaining in the world. Moreover, from personal acquaintances and credible reports, I think there is sufficient empirical evidence supporting the claim that at least one instance of non-resistant non-belief obtains. So at least one instance of one of the four types of non-resistant non-belief described above obtains. And quote from Daniel Howard Snyder, he says, he agrees and says, even though some non-believers lack true benevolence, the empirical evidence strongly suggests that others possess it, since they really do earnestly seek the truth about God. They love the good, assess evidence judiciously, and if anything, display a prejudice for God, not against him. Okay, this was premise number 6. Turning to the beginning of the argument, to premise 1, it claims that given the existence of God, God always perfectly loves such persons as there may be. In the background, there's the following sub-argument. Necessarily, if God exists, then God is a personal being. Necessarily, if God exists, God is unsurpassably great, or rather perfect. So necessarily, if God exists, God is a perfect personal being. Necessarily, if God is a perfect personal being, then God always perfectly loves all finite persons. So, necessarily, if God exists, then God always perfectly loves all finite persons. That's premise 1. Without a lot of ado, Schellenberg perceives that theists commonly are what might be called personal theists, endorsing perfect being theology. Of course, there are famous references for this concept of theism and of God, primarily Anselm of Canterbury's definition of God as id quo minus colitarium potest. And it is also no news that the God of central theistic texts like the Tanakh, the Bible, or the Quran, their God is characterized as a person who has intentions, will, feelings, thoughts, and acts. Moreover, among analytic philosophers of religion as well as theologians, thinking of God as a personal, perfect being has been quite popular in the last decades. If one thinks of the writings of its masters like Alvin Plantinga or Richard Swinburne, the former teacher of Schellenberg. Yet, I think one shouldn't leave aside completely that there are well-known influential and traditional alternatives to conceiving God as a perfect personal being. For example, those which stress God's simplicity, his immutability, his impassibility, his timelessness, and in particular God's utter transcendence. Sometimes the latter accounts are called classical theistic. Some say the former is the God of the Bible, the other the God of the philosophers. I will not comment on this, and I'm not clear if these concepts, if you can really say they're proponents of one of the two, and this is involved always. I will also not defend the claim that these concepts outlined here are not compatible or rather coherent. I will also not challenge the consistency of Anselm's work, who apparently also approves the latter divine attributes. However, all I would wish to say is that I remain critical of Schellenberg's easygoing, unchallenged assumption that theism is equivalent to personal theism. He says that's generally agreed on, and it conceives of God as a personal, perfect being, full stop. More exactly, I disapprove that this should be the case necessarily. But my main worry relates to, firstly, the seemingly univocal speech about God, which uses the concept of human personhood to apply its somehow extended, maximized version to God. And secondly, the claim that there is one uncontroversial, widely accepted concept of personhood. As Schellenberg asserts, I'm assuming we've got our present understanding of a person in view. Otherwise, all bets are off. The only description I found in Schellenberg's work is regarding what makes a person a person is the general notion that personhood implies evincing a genteel, intellectual, and affective qualities, which are not explicated furthermore. Yet the lively debates on personhood, for example, of whether empirical functionalism or ontological personalism is true, are not even touched. But the avoidance of the topic and use of analogical speech about God, resulting in the simplified, one might say, anthropomorphistic Superman concept of God, according to which God's personhood resembles human personhood, strikes me, intellectually speaking, as rather dangerous. I have to disappoint you that I have no good account of analogical speech here I can offer. But if I had, I would, to begin with, take into account what the Fourth Council of the Lateran stated, namely, that there are always more dissimilarities between finite persons and God than there are similarities. So, for example, as stated then, regarding analogia entis, all creation is similar to God, God the most perfect existence, in that creation merely exists. Yet creation is utterly dissimilar to God, in that God, the source of all existence, is likewise in all existence and above all existence. Even though I would grant Schellenberg even premise one, that it may be true, I remain doubtful that there is one uncontroversial concept of a person, and that divine personhood resembles human personhood without further qualifications. But the real problem lays in the implications of his non-analogical speech about God. This is particularly the case regarding premise 2, which lays out the implications of divine love, which are claimed to be conceptual truths in the human and thus also in the divine realm. Here, the simple extrapolation of examples of ideal love among humans shows the limits of this approach. Schellenberg has this sub-argument running behind premise 2. If God always perfectly loves all finite persons, then God at a minimum always seeks a personal relationship with any capable finite person. So perfect love implies at least seeking personal relationship with the beloved one. And if God always seeks a personal relationship with any capable finite person, then God is always open to being in a positively meaningful and reciprocal conscious relationship, which is a personal relationship with any capable finite person. So premise 2 is then necessarily, if God, I forgot the necessary quotation before, if God always perfectly loves all finite persons, then God is always open to being in a personal relationship with any capable finite person. The concept of perfect love consists, according to Schellenberg, in relational personal love, which necessarily implies openness to personal relationship with the beloved one. And a personal relationship is further qualified as positively meaningful and reciprocal and conscious that people who are in the relationship are aware of being in this relationship. In fact, premise 2 describes what is involved in this human-divine relationship from God's side, him being open to the relationship, qua his love, whereas premise 4 then entails what is involved from the other side regarding the human finite person. Okay, I have two obstacles or two criticisms on this premise. The first is, Schellenberg states that God, even though perfectly loving towards all finite persons, is open for personal relationship only to those who are capable of such a relationship. Schellenberg claims in premise 1 that God perfectly loves all finite persons, and that one implication of this love is seeking a relationship, which in turn implies openness. Why, in premise 2, is God claimed to be open only to those capable of a personal relationship? Of course, to defend Schellenberg, he doesn't state that God would be open only to the capable ones. So premise 2 is compatible with the claim that God, in fact, is open to all finite persons. And it is also in principle compatible with the claim that all finite persons actually have the needed capacities, so there are no incapable finite persons. But regarding the latter way of excuse or defending Schellenberg himself claims that some minority at a given time will not have the needed capacities. So this is not an option. And regarding the former, if this is the case, why would Schellenberg be motivated to formulate in such a seemingly restricted way? And if it is not, and God is claimed to be open only to those capable of relationship, why should one think perfect divine love to be limited in a way? Whereas in the human realm, one might claim that even perfect love involves openness to relationship only insofar as there is a real chance that the beloved one is capable of personal relationship. Regarding God, this seems to be implausible, especially because a person might become capable of relationship at some point of time, and God might, if you have this concept, know this in advance. So then he could be open even to those who are not capable of personal relationship at a time. The second obstacle consists of the implication by divine love which involves as a minimum seeking personal relationship, and the latter implying openness. According to Schellenberg, this is a conceptual truth derived by reflection on what perfect human love implies. He brings examples. Wouldn't we say that a perfectly loving mom were to be one who is always open for her child to reach out and relate to her? If a mom is thus open, how much more would a perfectly loving God be thus open to his beloved creatures for them to relate to God? Here the way of procedure, that's what I want to focus on by Schellenberg, becomes quite clear. The way Schellenberg derives what divine love involves is by merely philosophical reflection on our concepts of idealized human love and perfection, explicitly not involving theological thought or revelation-based sources. In fact, I think this is a very popular approach in contemporary analytic philosophy of religion and theology, which is merely based on intuitions and conceptual analysis on which theological claims are built. In Schellenberg's own wording, he is starting from above, and that's a good thing. Maybe the result of this way of thinking might make one skeptical of the way of thinking itself. In fact, some object to this deduction of Schellenberg that perfect love always implies openness for relationship. So, for example, to bring some other examples, one might think of a parent who, for some time, is not open for relationship with her beloved drug-addicted child who stole her money and is willing to go into rehab, and she is not open for relationship for a time for the sake of the good of her child and the possible future relationship between them. Or think of a couple, one of whom badly deceived the other one with someone else, and the one being deceived is even due to his great love to his wife not open for personal relationship anymore for the time being, for the sake of their possible future relationship. He may be hoping that after some serious reflection she realizes a huge mistake and is willing to save their relationship whatever it takes. So perfect love not necessarily must imply openness for relationship. Even though the truth of premise 2 is controversial, one might still say so far so good. Maybe Stenmark is at least right regarding a perfectly loving God. However, the implications of divine openness are enough reason to disagree with Stenmark. He argues like this. And that's, I think, the last sub-argument I present. If God is always open to being in a personal relationship with any capable finite person, then there is nothing God does, including omissions, or does not, which would prevent any capable finite person to be in a position to personally relate to God. If there is nothing God does or does not, which would prevent any capable finite person to be in a position to personally relate to God, then God makes available belief that God exists to any capable finite person which is not resistant to a personal relationship with God. So he would guarantee that a capable finite person not resistant is in a position, is able to relate to this God. And this implies, if God is such willing, that the capable person has belief that God exists. God would make this available. According to Stenmark, God would not overwhelm the finite person in question. No fancy wonders or stars aligned at the heavens saying, I am who I am, would be invoked. Rather, God would give each finite person the amount and mode of theistic evidence which is appropriate to the individual personality and background of that person. More exactly, God would offer evidence to that person which is sufficient to form or sustain the belief that God exists. He is here an evidentialist. And which Stenmark calls probabilifying evidence, rendering the existence of God probably true. It might be, more exactly, experiential or propositional evidence, the former consisting of a religious experience and the latter of some considerations involved in the traditional arguments for God's existence. Yet, unfortunately, no account of e.g. religious experience is given by Stenmark. He once writes roughly, it could be imagined like an inner radio turned on by God in a finite person, so that this person suddenly can hear the divine sound. Given the importance of this topic in the whole argument, similar with the notion of resistance, it may leave one a bit puzzled and curious about more details and clarification. Last bit, why will God see to it that every capable, non-resistant finite person believes that God exists? Because, according to Stenmark, without belief that God exists, a finite person is not able to personally relate to God. Premise 4, to remind you, states this. Necessarily, if God is always open to being in a personal relationship with any capable finite person, then it is not the case that any capable finite person non-resistantly lacks belief that God exists. So God makes available evidence which allows a capable person to form or sustain belief that God exists, so that the other person is in a position to relate to God. Without believing that God exists, that's impossible. Again, Stenmark argues that this follows from analyzing the concept of a personal relationship among humans, and that is a conscious and reciprocal relationship. And relating to such relationships between finite persons, he says it's a question of logic. It's a logical point to admit one couldn't even begin such a relationship, let alone develop it further on and engage in actions like promising, forgiving, or making plans for some future occasion together, if both parties involved, or at least one party involved, wouldn't believe that the other party exists. As Stenmark states, it's necessarily true that without belief in the existence of the other relatum of the relationship, one isn't able to personally relate to that other person. I must admit that I doubt that this is the case. In fact, I think that it's plausible that assuming that God exists is sufficient to allow someone to be in a personal relationship with God. I have not the time to go in here in detail. Shortly, I can say that I propose that belief that God exists and assumption that God exists are two possible instances of theistic faith that God exists. It may take two forms, or there are two types of faith that God exists. Belief, where you're very convinced that the proposition or the conclusion is true, or for example, the proposition that God exists, and assumption, where you're rather in doubt about the truth of the proposition that God exists. The former, belief, is an involuntary mental state which depends on the evidence available to one supporting the truth of the proposition. The latter, assumption, is a voluntary mental act to affirm the truth of a proposition, even though the evidence at hand neither supports the truth nor the falsity of the proposition in question. Basically, I'm relying here on the account of faith involving acceptance by William Alston as well as by Daniel Howard Snyder regarding faith as assumption. To hint at one empirical counterexample to premise 4, one might refer to Mother Teresa, who reportedly, as to be learned in her letters and writings published after her death, lacked belief that God exists the longest time of her life, and was yet able to personally relate to God and even accompany other spiritual journeys and even build up the huge community of the missionaries of charity, lacking belief that God exists. And I think there's some evidence that she was rather assuming that God exists. Among the most convincing responses to Stenmark's argument, however, are those which introduce additional premises showing that the existence of God is coherent with the occurrence of non-resistant non-belief. More exactly, such a promising rebuttal of the hiddeness argument compared to the argument from evil consists in identifying a state of affairs which obtains and which constitutes a good in God's view, for the sake of which God is willing to allow non-resistant non-belief. Such a rebuttal must argue further that God is able to instantiate the state of affairs if and only if God allows the occurrence of non-resistant non-belief to obtain. Hence, if the good state of affairs valued by God obtains, then God necessarily permits non-resistant non-belief. There has to be non-resistant non-belief. As a result, non-resistant non-belief is shown to be compatible with the existence of God. In other words, these replies claim to offer good reasons which God, if God exists, might have to allow the occurrence of non-resistant non-belief. As in the case of the argument from evil, there are theodicies and defenses, whereby the theodicies kind of reply claims to offer good reasons God actually has to allow for the state of affairs to obtain, whereas the latter defenses identify possible reasons God may possibly have to permit the state of affairs to obtain. As I see it, a rich bouquet of different defenses is likely to be most successful as a response to the hiddenness argument. The advantage of such a cumulative case argumentation is that one could offer different kinds of explanations for different types of non-belief, not letting one explanation carry the burden to account for all kinds of non-belief. To not further tax your patience, let me only by mere name dropping highlight some of those promising defenses. Among one of them is what might be called the unknown goods defense, which is likely to be enhanced by so-called skeptical theists, according to which there might be goods which we haven't recognized yet and may never be able to recognize, but which are necessarily tied to occurrence of non-resistant non-belief. But I think it's very dangerous to rely only on this defense. It might lead one into the waters of apophatic theology and silencing the debate. So one has to add something. The cooperative investigation defense claims that the good of jointly seeking preliminary knowledge about crucial matters like the question, if there is a God, and thereby taking deep responsibility for each other could not be achieved if everyone believed that there is a God, and this would be clearly evident that God exists. Third, according to the good dispositions defense, God permits non-resistant non-belief of some in order because they are not well disposed to relate to God and still need to develop the proper motives for a personal relationship with God and, for example, a kind of spiritual transformation. Yet the best defense in my eyes is the moral freedom defense or soul-making defense, which is prominent as a defense in the context of the argument from evil, and here says, in a world in which the existence of God were evident to every non-resistant finite person, one would be rather coerced to perform morally good acts or refrain from performing morally bad acts. As a result, one wouldn't be free in a morally significant way and thus lack the opportunity to develop morally significant characters. If one were to do the morally good, one would do so because one knows that God likes this, or because we then come into heaven and stuff like this. You get reward for this. It's for completely wrong motives. And wouldn't allow to develop morally significant characters. To come to a conclusion, is theism under further pressure now? No, at least not by the hedonist argument per se, for the reasonableness of theists is not taken into question even more, at least by it. As I've shown, some premises are rather likely not to be true. What is more, there are convincing defenses rendering the occurrence of non-resistant non-belief to be coherent with the existence of God. Schellenberg intends to disprove the existence of the God theism. Yet, as we've seen, it is a very specific, that is, personal concept of God which he entertains thereby, based on conceptual analysis of the terms involved in the human realm only. In fact, quote, within a large segment of contemporary Christendom, God has been increasingly portrayed as, in effect, a doting suburban helicopter parent whose entire day is structured around the interests and needs of his or her child. The result of his hidden considerations led Schellenberg to thinking that even though this personalized perfect being called God apparently does not exist, some other non-personal transcendent reality might exist, which motivated him to continue the religious quest in the context of his so-called evolutionary religion. But what if this concept of God was extended or some more complex features built in, or relational sources relied on? Who knows if Schellenberg would sympathize with theism again? Who knows if belief that a personally conceived God exists wouldn't diminish so fast and constantly in our secular societies, if our philosophy of religion would offer more apt concepts of God? At least I hope that I've made a plausible case that the hidden chance behind the hedonist argument lays in that it invites again for further reflection and debate, especially about the essence of theism, the doctrine of God, and an adequate speech about God. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. We have 10 or say 15 minutes for questions. Vladimir?
I'm sorry, I have not questions in the proper sense, but comments.
Yeah, please.
Okay. I really enjoyed your paper. I was scrutinizing it with all its footnotes. Yeah. But I have two comments. You emphasize two hallmarks in the history of the argument from evil. One from Epicurus and the second one from Schellenberg. Concerning Epicurus, it's a pity, but this is a very long-standing historical mistake. I mean attribution to Epicurus of this argument. trans as, if God is a perfectly good, how he can tolerate evil? If he is omnipotent, how he can admit it? And if he is both, where from evil comes? It is true that for many centuries everyone believed that after Lactantius, that the author of this sophisticated discourse was really Epicurus, but in 1988 German historian of philosophy Friedrich Reinhold, in the article entitled Das angebliche Epicur-Fragment by Lactantius, he repudiated and attributed it to skepticism. He found out many affinities between these syllogisms and reasonings in Sextus Empiricus, in Outlines of Pyrrhonism, in the third book. And concerning Schellenberg, about 2 years ago I published in an article on the problem of evil some comments on his argument. And I allow myself to refer to them. I wrote, Schellenberg's attention could be attracted to such a nuance that his calculations of the incalculabilities in human unbelief, and we have the pivotal member of his syllogisms, are accessible only to the omniscient being that knows the hearts of all humans, along with their inner histories, and whose existence he endeavors to refute just on the ground of these calculations. And thus his attempt to deprive God of his parental rights, and you were talking about anthropomorphisms, for admitting unbelief of his pretended children, really disclose problems with the existence of God, and not with today's social-cultural patterns of thinking, in accordance with which all the required for the good of a child should be required from a parent alone. Another pattern, cultural pattern, is has some obligations to his creations. Is it not such nonsense as one would say that a writer has obligations to his characters? And but even at the level of elementary logic, if unbelief of some people is regarded as sufficient reason for negation of the existence of God, should not belief of others who are still more numerous be regarded a good argumentum fortiori for affirmations of his existence? What do you think about such reasonings? Is it in line with yours or not?
What I understood from, I'm really curious about the paper, I think I have to read it. The last point, this obligations which derive from a certain character, I think I would resonate with this. And Michael Rear has a new really interesting book on the hiddenness of God, which was published last year by Oxford University Press, and he says the basic line is, in the argument from evil and hiddenness argument, it's violated expectations are laying at the root, right? So we have expectations of God deriving from his character, and we think that we expect a certain behavior and this is violated, and then we conclude, okay, this God doesn't exist. Yeah, I think it's really the interesting questions. If we're entitled to think to know what God really is like. And I think we should reflect on this and then reflect our expectations. And regarding the very first point, the historical point, yes, I've heard of this actually, but even if this is a rather, not dating back to Epicure, but to Sextus Empiricus still, then we have, it's not an offspring of modern time. The argument for evil, but
it
that's
is
also
an ancient argument,
exactly.
but not so ancient.
Not so ancient, it's later, okay. If Brian is right, but I wouldn't make a judgment because I've not a good historic judgment on this.
Thank you. Paul?
Okay, I have many comments to make and questions to ask. Just the question, would you please provide us with some examples, typical examples, where God has some reason to allow non-resistant non-belief? Because I think it is, in my view, it is the only failure, big failure in Schellenberg's argument. And if you provide some examples of, it is good that God does not makes him known by some creature, well, we have a counter-argument.
Yes, so this would be like the last part of the paper, the defenses I just sketched, which try to offer reasons why God is hidden. So, because like the last one I think is the strongest, he wants to allow that we are morally free. So if we know that God as good itself exists, we wouldn't be able.
Yes, so this is an argument from the epistemic distance made by Richard Swinburne. Says that we must keep a distance, or God makes everything to keep a distance between us and him, so that our searching for goodness is disinterested and not only submitted to a word.
I think yes, and also in John Hick's writings, it's like this cognitive freedom, which is provided by the epistemic distance, and then Swinburne and also Michael Murray, he is the prominent defender of this moral freedom defense. So this would be one. And the other, Richard Swinburne himself, says, well, what about, now we're like in the situation, he agrees, God's existence isn't that evident, even though probably true that he exists. We can together search for the good and make inquiries about the existence of God. And this wouldn't be the case if it would be completely clear that God exists. And since this has also existential weight, the question whether or not exists, because it relies on how I live, we can take deep responsibility for each other and make a huge impact on each other's lives while together searching for this, and are also really responsible for how we speak about God and what we do in this context, also self-critically. This wouldn't be the case. And then maybe also that people are not well disposed. That's the other thing, that people want to be in a relationship with God out of bad reasons, maybe to feel good, or having expectations on this relationship which are not appropriate, and having a wrong picture of God. So this is what John of the Cross says, like the mystic going through the dark night of the soul, there's this transformation, and he, at least as mystic, afterwards had another concept of God than before, and said and this wouldn't be possible if causes were evident to everybody. So this is just a few.
Well, I have many other points, but
yes.
it is time.
Maybe we have later time. Yes.
Thank you. I also enjoyed the paper very much. The thing that I didn't quite get had to do with that why you draw the conclusion that it puts no further pressure on theism. And it has to do, I think, with the parallel between the problem of evil and the hiddenness argument. I mean, when you talk about the problem of evil, the argument from evil, you say, well, the logical versions fail, so you have the evidential, especially when it comes to natural evil. So there is a discussion it put pressure on. And it seems to me what you've done with Schellenberg is just saying that his argument, when it's a parallel to the logical argument, that is when you try to disprove God's existence, fails. And that seems to be possible to obtain. But if the evidential versions of the argument of evil have put pressure on, then still Schellenberg's argument should put pressure on theism. So could you just elaborate how you think that there wouldn't be any more pressure, even if it's not a disprove?
So, because I think there are good defenses, so if you add further premises, then even the logical form doesn't work, so I wouldn't so, and then, yeah, the evidential version, we don't have to talk about this. And the other thing is like the critic of premises of the logical form of the argument.
Yeah.
Like the premise 4 that he says one sub-premise is there that you have to believe that God exists, person relate to God, and I doubt this. So I'm in the process of making a little account of faith and what is involved in faith, because I think he's talking about faith, that God exists, and I think it must not be belief. And if this premise is unsound, then the whole argument isn't sound. And the other thing is that in premise 2, the implication of divine love involving openness for relationship, there I'm also not so sure exactly. First, must this necessarily be the case, that I'm always open? And secondly, what is involved in this openness from Schellenberg's view is that God provides belief that God exists and makes everyone like, hey, here. And yes, this is, I think, I remain skeptical about this.
Can I just a quick reply? Because that would be the same to me as some theists trying to respond to the evidential argument from evil, saying, well, if you add certain premises and if you change certain things, you might be able to reject that kind of objection. But you think your case is stronger than what they possibly can do?
Maybe so. It's like what I understand the logical evidential version. So the logical is just that there's a real logical incoherence between the existence of God and the premises, and the evidential is like the amount of the evil makes rather, in the case of argument of evil, unlikely. And I would say even in the argument from evil thing, the logical argument can run through, even though there are good defenses, but then what really makes it hard is the evidential. And in the case of the argument of evil, on this, even the logical version, I think, is not sound, and not only because of defenses, but also the premises, I think. And plus, the evidential version wouldn't be that bad, because the state of affairs involved in the argument from evil, namely moral and natural evil, is per se bad and involves pain, whereas in the argument from hiddenness, the state of affairs involving non-belief, I think, isn't bad in itself. And that's maybe that's a point. But there's a debate, of course, about this. And some say the hiddenness problem is a part of the problem of evil because non-belief is bad, like from the evangelical strength. But I think maybe,
More questions?
Just an illustration of this problem of non-resistant non-belief. It is a story of a person who dies and encounters finally the Lord. And the person complains, "Oh Lord, I did never have any personal relationship with you, I didn't know you. You are guilty for that." And the Lord says, "Let's review your life. What do you see?" "Oh, I see 2 pair of footprints on the sand. This is mine, but what is the other?" The Lord says, "It is mine." But then the person said, "Oh, here there is just 1 footprint. And those are the periods of my life where I had hard suffering, so you're not a perfectly loving God." And the Lord says, "No, look, this footprint is more deep than before, and I was burying you."
So let's thank Veronica, and let's shift the gears and proceed to Bogdan Faul. He's from St. Petersburg State University. Will talk about Greco-Oppi.
There is another. На флешке? А здесь еще? А я О. Thank you very much. This is good. Yeah. Oh yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, I see. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's the good one. I also yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah, great. So thank you. That's right. I think that. Okay. Let's see. Yes.
It's magic.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. French politique.
So, hello everyone. My name is Bogdan, as you can see from the presentation, and I am very happy to be here today and to present my current state of arts on thinking about the argument from religious experience. And today I'm going to analyze some parts from Greco-Oppi's book, which is called The Best Argument Against God. And there is a fragment here on the argument from religious experience. And I think that it is very interesting in the context of this conference. Because I think that he has some very interesting intuitions here, which many people also have when the argument from religious experience is discussed just in regular situations. Okay, and so I will firstly present the argument from religious experience, and then I will show how Greco-Oppi rejects it, and then I will analyze his points. So this is just a work in progress, so don't judge too strictly, please. Okay, so this is the argument from religious experience as I see it, and we can put this argument very differently, but the idea is that if sorry.
French politique is not function.
Oh. Yeah, so the argument, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so the argument from religious experience is supposed to increase the epistemic probability that God exists. The epistemic probability is very tightly connected with epistemic rationality, as you all know. And if the religious experience makes it more epistemically probable that God exists, then it is more rational for us to believe that God exists. And the first premise, that if S is the subject, if somebody has an experience X that B is the case, X increases in epistemic probability that B is the case if there are no relevant overriders. So I will go to the notion of overrider next. S has X, which implies that God exists. So somebody has a religious experience which implies that God exists. For example, he feels that there are many types of religious experience, but what religious experience are mostly discussed in the literature is the experience that God somehow, that there is a God, that you just directly feel him somehow. And this experience implies that there is a God, so that the proposition that God exists is true. So the third premise is there are no relevant overriders, and therefore this experience, which implies that there is a God, raises or increases the epistemic probability for S that God exists. And if the epistemic probability is connected with epistemic rationality, then it is more rational for S to believe that God exists, given that he has the relevant religious experience. And so let's just go to the first premise. And the first premise is basically the principle of credulity, which was introduced by Richard Swinburne. And this principle is very easy, that if it seems to me that something is the case, it is more probable than not that it is the case, if there are no some good objections to that. And this principle is very general, and the basic motivation for this principle is that it helps us to avoid global skepticism. We believe that there are tables and chairs here, right? That there are bottles, and we believe this, and we believe that they are here only on the basis of our experience. And it seems that there are no good reasons to exclude religious experience from all the experiences. So if the religious experience is the same as the experience of tables and chairs, then it all shows that this kind of experience should also have this epistemic power, that it should increase the probability, the epistemic probability that God exists. And it seems that the principle of credulity is very popular because 82% of contemporary philosophers are non-skeptical realists. And this is according to the Bourget and Chalmers research. Well, I'm not sure that their motivations for being a non-skeptical realist is directly connected to the principle of credulity, but I think that they at least share this basic intuition that it is just obvious that there are tables and chairs. And I think that this realist conception of that this realist common Western realistic metaphysics is very popular today in contemporary analytic philosophy. So this is the principle of credulity. And we see that the principle of credulity works only if there are no good objections to this kind of experience. And Richard Swinburne defines two kinds of objections. There are rebuters and underminers. Rebuters are the good reasons to believe that P is false, that the proposition in question is false. For example, when I look at the cloud and I form a proposition on the basis of the experiencing of the cloud, that there is a cloud, and rebuter is, and something is a rebuter if and this experience is refuted if somebody proves to me that this is not actually a cloud, this is actually an alien ship, for example, which creates an illusion that there is a cloud. So if I have good reasons to believe, that there is a cloud is false, then the religious experience is overridden. So we see that we know that there is no cloud. The second kind of overrider is called an underminer. And this is the good reason to believe that we are not connected to the reality in a very good way. So, for example, something is wrong with my eyes. Every time when I see, for example, a house, I, for some unknown reasons, believe that it is a cloud. And somebody proved to me that I have this, for example, brain defect in processing, or my eyes are not working properly. So that the way that I am connected to the reality is not very good. And if somebody proved to me that this is the case, then this religious experience is undermined. And what is interesting in the Opie's argumentation is that he attacks not only the premise that there are no relevant overriders, but is that he attacks that we have this kind of religious experience which implies that God exists. So, in his paper, he provides two reasons to think that religious experience lacks evidential powers. The first reason is the religious component in religious experiences is a matter of interpretation. The R2 is that there is a significant cultural variation of religious experience. So the reason one, R1, is connected to the second premise, and the reason 2 is connected to the third premise. And I'll explore it a little bit later. So So let's talk about the R1. The religious component in religious experience is a matter of interpretation. So as you see, it means that the experience we have does not imply that there is a God. And Graham Oppy says that the atheists, they actually have the religious experience, but they just interpret it differently. For example, what is religiously interpreted as feeling completely at home in the cosmos, what is religiously interpreted as oneness, for example, in some Eastern traditions, he says that it could be naturalistically interpreted as feeling completely at home in the cosmos without this religious component, and which is religiously interpreted as epiphany, he says, could be non-religiously interpreted as looking at familiar things from a new perspective. So his idea is that the whole religious content in religious experience, which we consider prima facie to be supernatural, is actually a matter of interpretation. And I think that it is very easy to reject it. Because we can see here a hidden assumption that the religious experience does not determine its interpretation. So the idea is the following one. We have a religious experience, and it is equally good interpreted as naturalistic experience or as religious experience. So this is what Oppy has in mind, that the one and the same experience could be interpreted differently. But, as I believe, there is an empirical objection that there are such experiences which determine its religious interpretation. For example, some Christian mystics, they can see the Tabor light. Or, for example, if someone encounters angels, it is very hard to interpret it naturalistically. So, I think that those kinds of religious experience has the type of content which determines the religious interpretation. And so, if this is the case, if such experience really obtained in our world, then the R1, the objection that Oppy gives, that the religious component is a matter of interpretation, fails, as I believe. So, I think that we can modify his R1, that not religious component is always a matter of interpretation, but that the religious component in religious experience is sometimes a matter of interpretation. So this is the modification that I provide. And we can define two kinds of experiences. The determinative and the determinative religious experiences. These are the religious experiences that the content of which is necessarily interpreted as being prima facie supernatural, and non-determinative religious experiences, which could be interpreted as in a religious way or in a naturalistic way. And so, we can modify the second premise according to this modification of his of R1, and that if S has the in X, which is deterministic religious experience, then it necessarily implies that God exists, and so the argument goes. I think that this is a good reason to reject his first objection, the reason why he thinks that the argument from religious experience doesn't work. Now we can proceed to the second objection, that there is a significant cultural variation of religious experiences. And I think that that what he says further relies on a very interesting assumption that if there existed some supernatural reality, then we should not expect this cultural variation of religious experiences. And I think that this assumption is very problematic. Based on this assumption, we can make two inferences. The strong inference from R2 and this assumption is that naturalistic explanations of religious experiences explanations of the source of religious experiences are always better than supernatural ones. And the big inference from R2 and AR2 is that the diversity of religious experience doesn't justify particular religious belief. So, but those religious experiences at least rule out the naturalistic explanations. So these are two inferences which are possible here. And I believe that we should also modify R2 because this positive statement that given that there is a supernatural reality, we should not expect this cultural variation is very implausible and it should be augmented additionally. I think that the more plausible premise is skeptical, AR2 what I call, is that we don't know whether we should expect such variation of religious experience if its source would be an independent supernatural reality. Yes, if there is a supernatural reality, who knows what experiences people should have. And I think that this skeptical solution, which is more plausible, I believe, determines the big inference from R2 and AR2 that the diversity of religious experience doesn't justify particular religious beliefs, but anyway, it rules out naturalistic explanations. So this is what I believe should follow from what Opie writes, because if we see those assumptions which I explored, we will see that they are not so plausible, and modifying them in a more plausible way leads us to different conclusions. And so the conclusions of this talk are the following ones: that R1, that the R1 is objective. The first of his objections leads to the conclusion of R1 that only some religious experiences works has evidential power, which are the determinative religious experiences. So, which means that his first objection doesn't reject the argument, but only narrows the relevant religious experiences, which increases the epistemic powers. And the second objection which Opie gives, that there is a significant cultural variation of religious experience, doesn't reject the argument also. It just says that it just rules out the concrete religious interpretation. But still, given this R2, the religious experience increases the probability that there is a supernatural reality. So, I believe that Opie's main goal was to reject the argument from religious experience, but he just actually modified it in a little bit. And this modification, as I believe, is a plausible one. Because if we are working in an evidentialistic perspective of justification of religious beliefs, then the argument from religious experience is still works and still serves in the way that it should, because our particular religious beliefs are grounded on other evidences also. So this is the conclusion, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bob, for your nice detailed presentation. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, I love it. I thought it was very good. And I think you have parallels to it if you wanted to have John Hick and Gary Gatting. Gary Gatting had a book back in the 90s called Religious Beliefs and Religious Skepticism. That's similar to this. But I was wondering whether one should continue the argumentation and say, from this it follows that the person that has religious experience should decrease his or her confidence in her beliefs. I mean, you see what I'm saying? So it could be that there's a reason to reject naturalism, but just due to the fact that you have this plurality of religious experience, the one that is having it should decrease the degree of confidence or strength or epistemic strength should lower somewhat. What would you say to that kind of thing? Because typically religious people that are philosophers tend to be very confident about the content of what they experience.
Yeah.
So maybe one should draw the conclusion that the rational way to proceed, looking at this argument, is also that they should lower their degree of epistemic confidence.
Yeah, so I think that the first problem is whether this religious content is determinative or not. Because those religious people, they just can't believe they can believe that the content that they experience, the religious content, is very determinative. Yeah. And that is the one way to put it. Yeah. Another way to put it, as I see it for now, is that we have some background beliefs about what religions are true, what is the true religion, right? Mm-hmm. So if we believe that only one religion is true, for example Christianity, and we have this background belief, then the Christianity is the correct interpretation of religious experience. And so the idea is that when we have this kind of religious experience, what is the best interpretation of it? And the Christian interpretation is the best one. So this also shows that, well, as I see it, we can say that it doesn't lower our confidence in this religious experience. So these are two ways which I see from that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for your paper. Enjoy very much. When I think about naturalistic interpretation of religious experience, I think that we can divide it into two parts. The naturalistic part and additional metaphysical part. In case of metaphysical naturalism, it's obvious. Do you think that religious interpretations can have many variations, and naturalistic interpretations in the metaphysical part can have many variations in the case of religious experience? For example, there are many interpretations of physics. What stands on the other side of physical laws? There are much variability on physics itself. So how do you think about it in the light of your paper?
Yeah, thank you. I think that we should distinguish two types of this naturalistic interpretation. The first type is what is the source of experience, right? It could be God, or it could be something natural, some brain processes and nothing more, for example. The source of religious experience. And the second part is the content of religious experience, whether it is religious or not in this sense, so the phenomenology itself, right, what is given. And I think that, of course, we can have multiple naturalistic interpretations. What is the source of our experience? Because then I think that most naturalists will just say that the source is what science will tell us the source is. And science can tell different stories about the source. And, but I'm not sure, but I think that I'm not, I can't say anything about the phenomenological content of whether we can give multiple interpretations of our phenomenology when we face the religious experience. Because I just consider it to be, well, in my religious experience, the content was always religious, and I just don't see any way how I can interpret it differently. So this is a more complicated problem as I see the phenomenology of religious experience and so on. So I have nothing to offer. Sorry.
Additional question, a little one. When you say religious content of experience, you mean, what do you mean?
Yeah.
You think that content is something that the propositional part, or it's epistemological cognitive procedure of
So
achieving?
it's also a not easy question, because the propositional part goes after the experience. So if we just cut out our cognitive processing of our phenomenology, then we will lack any propositional content. So it will be just a bunch of colors and so on. But when we just try to understand what is going on, then some propositional content occurs, as I see it for this moment. And by this religious component in phenomenology, I mean a very simple thing. So I don't have a very good metaphysical definition of how we can distinguish the naturalistic and supernatural components in phenomenology. But I'm just talking about a very simple thing, that there is a class of phenomenological experience which seems prima facie to be supernatural. That is just the way I put it. It is this is not a very good definition, but I think that this is enough for playing with all these things we are talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I have a short question and a short comment. Yes, I believe that your differentiation between determinative and non-determinative religious experiences are good and persuasive. Though it needs some coming into details, certainly. But your paper is critical to OPE, but the upshot runs as objections to the, I refer to you, to the argument from religious experience is not totally successful. What is not totally successful? Is it almost successful, or it is only a little bit successful? What do you comment?
How to make this modification not totally more concrete, right? Well,
what volume of successfulness would you ascribe to him?
I don't know.
Give us an account.
Yeah,
we would like to weight it. Yeah.
in percent, right? So I would say that if one thinks that his rejection is 100% successful, I would say that it's only 52% successful. Oh no, maybe 50. Let's.
It is like my friend Richard Swinburne's calculation.
Yeah. I was just thinking very hard about this. It's 52.
Well, and as to me, I believe that the naturalistic interpretation of religious experience is very like such an idiotic interpretation of a concept, where only visible contributors to it are acknowledged, like musical instruments, orchestra exponents, and even the hall, where a performance takes place, but not the composer, because he is invisible for interpreters.
Yeah, I agree.
Please. I would like to ask you about your determination of the experience. Your reference to the bottles and tables is working only if we consider classical scientific paradigm, and even a non-classical, according to Sleptsova. But in the context of quantum mechanics, you could not just point to some object and say it is it's a wave or it's a particle. Do you see?
Yeah, okay.
And don't you think that your argument is very flexible, even in the context of physical knowledge?
Yeah, good, thank you for this question. I don't think that physics is relevant here, because the problem of what objects exist is a metaphysical problem, not the physical one. This is called the problem of mereological composition. So, it is called the, so the question is what objects exist, what mereological sums exist, and so on. And I don't think that physics has something very interesting to offer here. It just says so it would just clarify what is the nature, how these, from what stuff these objects are composed. This is what physics can tell in this situation. There are metaphysical views metaphysical views on what objects exist. For example, the mereological nihilism, which says that there are no objects at all, there are just mereological symbols. But it also doesn't, this is not connected to my views. I was just trying to express the very simple idea that there is some independent reality which we perceive and which we can talk about in a reasonable way. So I don't think that there is any connection with those underlying metaphysics of objects and the views that I'm talking about in this presentation and talk. Yeah. So this is my
and the problem still exists. The object that you can deal with is only object that not in metaphysical in nature. So
we can, for example, we can. Okay, let's define.
We could touch only a physical object. You see?
Okay.
Do you agree? Or you
I don't
touch a metaphysical object?
we can, well, by metaphysics I mean this, just what is in reality. This is the meaning I have in mind when I'm talking about the metaphysics. The objects, the objects themselves, they of course have physical nature. So they consist of some physical stuff. But when we are talking about the problem of what objects exist, we say that it is a metaphysical problem because we can't settle this problem in physical, using the physical concepts and physical terms and physical instruments, because these problems are completely different. For example, this is my view. This is what I see,
okay.
And what I think that. We can define two ways of talking about the external world. If there is an external world, if you believe in an external world, whatever it is, whether it has metaphysical nature or physical nature, well, I'm not sure that we are using good terms here to talk about the external world. But nevertheless, if you believe that there is an external world, like most people believe, in common Western metaphysics, then everything that I say is correct. If you don't believe that there is an external world, then it seems that it is you who should argue for that, in the first place, because I believe in the principle of credulity.
If I understood you said that the experience is nothing. The foundation of any knowledge is belief, is faith in something.
No, why? I was just, that was exactly the point I was making, that the experience is a good thing, and it can increase the epistemic probabilities that some proposition is true.
But the experience doesn't work even in the context of physical science, you see?
No, it works. It works, of course it works. So if I see something and I say, look, we can talk about this bottle, whatever it is. It can be a real bottle standing here with some precise boundaries, right? Or it can be just a bunch of atoms. This is just what we, bunch of atoms and bunch of quarks and some physical matter. We can talk about the bottle, but we can specify its nature differently. We can say, yes, it has boundaries and it has a metaphysical nature, some metaphysical nature. It is a mereological sum, mereological fusion. This is the one way. Another way is when we say bottle, we just mean those bunch of quarks and electrons and all this stuff. These are just when we are trying to specify what the bottle is. But whatever our specification is, we can talk about the bottles in a reasonable way. So, and the level I am working on is this one. So, I am not going into these deep waters of metaphysics, what exists and so on, because these are very controversial.
But the problem in the context of quantum mechanics that this bottle or this object or this particle in reality doesn't exist before the measurement. And the measurement, the means of measurements defines the nature of this object.
Yeah, okay, but
particle or wave.
Okay, the first point is that you are presupposing the particular interpretation of quantum mechanics. The second point is that even if everything is composed of waves without precise boundaries, there are metaphysical views which say that objects can have not precise boundaries. For example, this is the Weidner view, that objects are just vague, they have vague boundaries. So this is what you say about physics is not a very does not create some knocking out problems for any metaphysics.
Thank you. Yeah, Valeria?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two comments maybe. I think that good example of your thought about angels or type of light may be Jewish Shokhin, and I think so. And the second is I don't understand some preposition. Are two. There is a significant cultural variation in RE, and therefore, and what therefore? OP says that there is RE, or there are a lot of variations of a lot of phenomena of cultural phenomena.
So about the first question is that if you don't believe that these are the determinative religious experience, we can just make some very determinative religious experience. For example, I'm not sure whether these are actual religious experience, but these are possible ones. That the voice from the sky just says, "I am the Lord. Christianity is true," for example. So this is the possible scenario. I believe that God exists, and I was just trying to make some to show some examples of such experiences. I think that actually, as far as I know, different mystical traditions, they surprisingly have very similar experiences, right? For example, but these are deep waters, and we shouldn't go there. And the second question is that what Opi says about this R2. It is very hard to say because this is what I was working on. So this is the strong inferences you see and the weak inference. These are as I was working on his text.
that he could go either to the strong inference or to the weak inference. And I was trying to understand what is the right one of them. So Opi's point is very simple. Is that some people live in India, some people live in Russia, and they have different beliefs, they have different religious experiences. How they should, and given that, how would they say that their religious experience justifies something? So this is just the basic underlying intuition there.
But all these phenomena he noted as religious experience. All this Indian or Russian. And why? Which basis features he sees here?
So why they are called religious? This is your question. Why he calls them those kinds of experiences religious experience? Well, he doesn't have an explicit definition of religious experience, and this is another problem. Usually when philosophers discuss the religious experience, they presuppose that they know what they are talking about, something which seems to be supernatural. Yeah, so
which is self-evident.
Yeah, so this is the idea. But of course, this is the huge problem, and in the literature of religious experience, this is a very interesting problem which philosophers are working on.
Yes, well, it is still about the interpretation of religious experiences. The argument from religious experience has been exposed by Opie as if it were an isolated argument.
Yeah.
But it is rarely the case.
Yeah.
Take for example Swinburne. He says it is just an additional argument in the cumulative inductive argument, and he even says it is just the tip on the balance that makes that, on the whole, you're allowed to say that theism is valuable or right. And I wanted to focus this point because we never, it seems to me, we never interpret an experience from scratch. We have a cultural, a linguistic background, and our interpretation will deeply depend on what are our general beliefs. Metaphysical belief, is there an external world or not? Is everything submitted to laws of nature, or are we a reason to think or to believe that there must be something else? Do we agree with a self-existent world made of physical entities or not? And then we proceed to interpret an eventual religious experience. So that weakens, in my view, the argument of Graham Hoppe, but it doesn't weaken your work because given this presupposition, it's interesting. And just a remark, Swinburne makes an interesting point. He said that even on a naturalistic interpretation of some experience, you still have to wonder why there are laws of nature that make you feel good when you contemplate sunlight.
Yeah.
Okay. He gives another example. He says, well, you can prove scientifically that under a strong diet, your brain events will be affected so that you might have new thoughts that you never had before. But even this naturalistic prediction could be evidence for God's willing that people who renounce eating and drinking too much have a new feeling of what is valuable in the world.
So thank you very much. I agree with your first point, and the second point I wanted to make a brief comment on it is that the distinction between interpretation of the source I was talking about and the interpretation of the phenomenological content. Yes, usually in the literature of religious experience, They say that even if we can explain the source of religious experience in a naturalistic way, it doesn't say that there is no God among those causal sources, that he could cause these naturalistic causes which cause us to have the religious experience. And God may have some good reason to do so, to do that. Yes, but the naturalistic interpretation I was talking about lies in the phenomenological field of interpretation. For example, we can feel the oneness with the world, that we have no boundaries or we have no ego, for example. This is the religious way to put this experience. And the naturalistic way to put this experience, oh, it is so good that I exist in this physical cosmos. For example, I don't know what is the exact naturalistic interpretation of this kind of experience, but I want to point to this idea that we are discussing the phenomenological content of religious experience, which could be interpreted differently. And the source idea, that what is the source, is a different problem. This is what is exactly a question. So, does our experience, the phenomenological experience, somehow increases the probability that there is a supernatural source for that, or it doesn't? Yeah, so, yeah.
The additional question. Suppose I am the successor of Graham Hoppe, and I said, well, Bogdan, you've convinced me the argument from religious experience does not fail at all costs.
Yeah.
But what about an argument from counter-religious experience?
What?
From counter-religious experience. We said, okay, we are many and even more former believers, and so the very fact that we have a negative experience or a non-resistance belief is evidence for God, or diminishes, weakens the epistemic probability of God's existence.
Yeah, but this is so I wouldn't say that there is some phenomenological experience of that there is no God, because this is the common strategy. This is what Swinburne says, that there is no such experience that there is no God. So there is no anti-religious experience. But I would say that
this is a problem.
Yeah.
There is a great discussion about negative facts.
Yeah, but these negative facts is an addition to this experience. So this is how we think about our experience in general. So we can take our life and say we have so it seems that there is no so much religious experience in our life. It would be more of it if God existed. So this is the additional idea of how we think about our phenomenological experience. And I think that, and this is wholly propositional. So, if God existed, we would have, for example, 50 religious experiences in our life, strong religious experience. But I had only 30, and that is the problem. Maybe God does not exist. For example, this is the general idea of how we think about it. This is well, I think that this is the core intuition of all this strategy, and this is, as far as I can see, a completely different discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Bogdan, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. So, I have 3 very short comments. First one is that I think that also our normal perception involves interpretation. It is always so. At least the textbook of psychology says us. And so, this first one, you could maybe draw a conclusion from this, maybe not. So quite right. So, second one. It seems to me that such a notion as religious experiences don't build any uniform notion. So, and I think it's very uncritical to speak of religious experience in general. Why? And first of all, religious themselves are very critical to religious experiences. So, and also, for example, a religious person may experience the absence of God, but he does not conclude for this. Well, he should not conclude for this. There is no God. So it is a part of experiences. And I would say, if it means just that it is an experience with religious content, it's something that's very different from a religious experience in genuine sense. And so, and in this background, it's very hard to evaluate the argument in general. So, even against the existence of God, but also existence for existence of God. It's very difficult against this background. And third comments would be, it seems to me that Opie's argument is a particular case of general skepticism. So I conclude this from my first remark, because if I'm skeptical against my perception, so I could be skeptical against all my experience in general. But why then I should take only religious experience? And so we see that most philosophers are not general skepticists. Then we can ask why they should be skeptical in regarding to religious experiences. What's really the reason such elective skepticism? So, and so far, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. I think that I'll start from the third thing. I'm not sure that I understood you properly, but I think that of course, our experience is a matter of interpretation, and our Gestalt perception is also some interpretative stuff, is an interpretative thing that we see. We see that there are objects, that they have boundaries and so on. This is the Gestalt perception. There is also an interpretative component in it. And yes, I agree that interpretation is always what follows the experience, but I don't see the further problem, because there are some interpretations which are more probable than not. For example, when I see this bottle, it is more probable than that it is just a bottle, than that some aliens came here and made a hologram of the bottle. So these are two interpretations of what is going on in the world. They are both compatible with my perception, right? But one of those interpretations is bad, and another one is good. So we can compare those interpretations. And the idea is that we should choose the best interpretation always. The way how we assess whether the interpretation is good or bad is another problem, but the general idea is this. And so that is I'm not sure that I'm answering your questions, sorry. So, but yeah, these are just comments on the first and third ideas. And the second one about the definition of religious experience. Yes, of course, different religious traditions, they have different ways of understanding what are good religious experiences and what are the bad ones, right? So we know that in Orthodox tradition this is a very interesting thing, how we can distinguish those types of experiences. But I believe that anyway, these are religious experiences, all of them. And I agree that the term religious experience is a term from the natural language, actually. Well, at least philosophers, when they talk about the religious experience, they use the natural language term, religious experience. So something which we call a religious experience is a religious experience. So this is an umbrella term which picks up so many different things. But I don't think that the fact that we use this umbrella term to talk about the religious experience, this fact somehow undermines the reason about the religious experience and the assessment of its evidential powers. So this is just a way of how we pick up something from the world, and after that we try to assess whether this experience increases the extent probability that something is the case or not. So this is the way of picking out things from the world. We can give a good definition, right? So we can give some very precise definition. This kind of religious experience, for example. Yeah. And that definition is also going to pick up something from the world. And this way of picking out something is not worse than this way of picking out something from the world, to reasonably talk about it and to have a good productive discussion about this. So this is my comment on the second one. It's not an answer. It's just my point of view on this.
How many questions do we still have to please ask, and then open the floor?
Okay. And yeah, thanks a lot for this great presentation and way of presenting. I've learned shorter is better, and I also love the discussion now and your way of explaining the further on or giving us more content for discussion. Regarding the definition of religious experience, what I've read and memorized is like that sometimes it's defined as an experience of the presence of God. And then, of course, it's a question what does presence mean? But would you agree with this very general notion that religious experience is somehow sense of the presence of God?
I think that this is, that is what it seems that Alston has in mind when he's talking about religious experience. That is what he wants to do. He wants to define some religious experience and talk about it precisely. So, and he says that, this is the experience of presence of God, or here's some kind of direct experience of the presence of God. But I think that there are different types of religious experience. For example, what he has in mind when he's talking about this presence of God, I think that he has in mind this theistic God. As we all know. So, but there are different religious experiences. For example, when people experience non-theistic gods. This I would call also religious experience, and I would say that they also have some evidential powers. Maybe so. The discussion of what is the source of this experience, is this a good experience or bad experience, is another one. So we can talk about it. This is a completely different discussion, but I would call it a religious experience also. And I think that it is interesting to put those kinds of experience to the argument for religious experience too. Yes. So this is my short answer. Yeah. I'm not sure whether it's whether I answered, but
no, you did. I didn't want to pretend like religious experiences only experiences of the theistic God. I would grant, of course, of other gods, but just like the presence of these divine realities, something is maybe involved in a religious experience. And I found very interesting that Otto says that if there is a supernatural reality, we shouldn't expect different cultural variations of religious experience, or like others suppose, if that's correct.
But he's not talking about it explicitly. I was just
you extract this from
I was just reflecting on his way of argumenting, and I thought that this is the only assumption that ties everything together.
Yeah. So if he has it, but I think you made a plausible case that he has it, and I find it so surprising that one shouldn't expect the opposite. I mean, given the cultural background and given what we know now from cultural psychology, that our way of interpreting the world is influenced by our upbringing and our social context. We should expect that religious experiences in India are different from ones in the United States. And that, and the other point is, I was wondering what you think about it, that on the other hand, Hick, for example, when describing mystical experiences, which is one sub-form of religious experiences, no opposite. The interesting thing is that in the different world religions, there is some common descriptions of religious experience. It's not that different. I mean, it's a very special kind of religious experience, but I was wondering what you think.
That's a very interesting point. And the opposite idea of that we should not, that given that there is a supernatural reality which somehow opens itself to persons, we should not expect that that all persons will have the same religious experience, is a very plausible idea. I was thinking about it when I was trying to reject his assumption. But then I realized that the skeptical rejection also is the same as this negative rejection, but it is more plausible. What do we know about the divine reality? We have no idea, right? So this just requires less argumentation. This skeptical rejection of obvious assumption. So that is why I've chosen the skeptical one. So, and I agree, so that there is an interesting thing in religious experience, that mystical experiences are described in the same way. Different mystical traditions. This is very interesting. But the idea is, what is the, I've talked about that before, what is the correct interpretation of these mystical experiences, which are kind of the same. And that is why we have those background beliefs about religions and what is the true religion. And if we believe that Christianity is true, then we should say that the Christian interpretation of these mystical experiences is true, and not another. For example.
Or others would say, because there are these common explanation descriptions of these mystical experiences, this is somehow a sign that there is whatever transcends reality, because it's really surprising that there would be also one path to
So when people try very hard, they get the same thing. Maybe.
I'm afraid we have no time. We have some minutes. So I have two simple questions. First, there is religious experience and there is everyday experience. So there are different kinds of experiences. So how can they have the same epistemological status? I don't understand this. And second question, I think Hopi shows us wrong way, because if God speaks with you, you can't interpret it as a kind of oneness. It's totally different types of experiences. So we can't take one for the other. So from my point of view, the problem of atheism is not different kinds of interpretations and different kinds of experiences, but the problem of atheism is the problem of absence religious experience at all.
So thank you very much. I'll start with the second question, because this is what I exactly was talking about when I introduced this determinative religious experience. So what you have, this is actually an objection to Opi, and you have the same one, as I understand, that there are some religious experiences which cannot be interpreted naturalistically, and this is also my point. And the third idea is that the problem of atheism is that there is no religious experience. Yes, I agree that there is such a problem, but it is not related to the argument from religious religious experience, because what is at question is whether the religious experience, if it obtains, if there is a religious experience, whether it has some evidential powers or not. So, so this is the question I was discussing. What you say is interesting, but it is not directly related to my talk today. And so I think these are deep waters, the different thing. And the first question was about
different kinds of experiences.
Yeah, yeah, different kinds of experiences. This is the exactly the principle of credulity point. That if we say that there is an everyday experience and there is a religious experience, we could say that they are the same in their evidential, that they have the same evidential status, or they have different one. But if they have different evidential status, what is the difference between them? What is the difference between our everyday experience and our religious experience? And this is where Swinburne defines those two kinds of explanation, what could be the difference between those two experiences. So we either have a rebuter for our religious experience or undermining for our religious experience. And he says that religious experience is basically could not be refuted, or it could not be undermined. So there is no explanation of this difference between our everyday experience and religious experience, and that is why they have the same evidential powers. So this is the answer to your first question.
But if I have an experience of table, I can understand you. But if I have no religious experience, I can't understand you. I can't feel, I can't see what you are talking about.
Yeah.
So the evidential status is different.
Yeah, of course, but we are talking about the epistemic rationality. So we are talking about a person. We are talking about a person who has this experience. So does this experience increases his epistemic probability that something is the case? So that is what we are talking about. If someone doesn't have this kind of experience, then it doesn't raise his epistemic probability. But someone could have this experience. For example, God says to him, I am Lord, and Christianity is true. Then his epistemic probability rises very much, rises very high. This guy doesn't have this experience, and this guy has. And they have, and so their belief that Christianity is true has different evidential status. For example, this guy is less justified in believing that Christianity is true than this guy who had this kind of experience. So, of course, religious experience is not the same as experience of our ordinary objects, in the sense that people don't have the same access to them. We can talk about, we have the same access to tables, but not the same access to the divine reality. But we are talking about persons who somehow interacted with this divine reality. And does this interaction, or what seems prima facie to be the interaction, does it raise or does it increase the epistemic probability that there is this divine reality? And this is what I was discussing, that the argument from religious experience says that if a person has this kind of interaction with something which seems to be the divine reality, then it is more rational for him to believe that there is such a divine reality. So that is my answer to this question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bogdan. So we have now time for lunch. I think it's enough time. Oh yeah. So see you here, and you may also leave your things here because we lock the room, and so everything will remain safely here. Thank you.
Are we going together somewhere, or are we
Yeah.
splitting up?
Yeah.
Or-
We're getting the transport 40 minutes.
In another room?
Yeah, room number 4.
Yeah, okay.
In order to acknowledge this consistency, we have before believe that it is possible. I am only come to the possibility of this. And in a way, in order
Ну, принцип языка.
to the same age,
Well, we do the
to
start.
believe before that
Yeah,
God
of course.
himself
Physiology. I do.
It's the point that I try to make as
Every case in
of
the
relation
world.
to natural knowledge of or at least the natural
So you made
high probability that it can
it's not a physiology.
But if we encounter this kind of experience, we can explain it. But the one is explained. For example, we don't believe that God exists, or we think that it is impossible. But of course, it is logically possible that God exists. But we just believe that it is metaphysically possible that God exists because He does not exist, and if He exists necessarily, then if He does not exist in our world, then He necessarily does not exist.
I'm sorry, we have to go.
Yes, so we can believe. So we can't believe that God does not exist.
close logically. You should do it because it would be too hot. This is